Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to Columbia University, both to our audiences that are online, joining us from around the world, and those of you who managed to make it here in person today. I know it was not easy, so thank you so much for being here. My name is Azmat Khan, and I'm an investigative journalist. I'm also a professor here at the Journalism School and the director of the Simon and June Lee Center for Global Journalism. The Lee Center's mission is to help inform and shape how we practice journalism with a global lens. And I can't think of a subject that so justly honors that mission more than the one that we'll be having today about the impacts of changing warfare technologies on civilians in combat zones. As you all know, it's a timely one. I'm especially pleased that the Lee Center joined forces with the Mailman School's program on forced migration and health and the Columbia Global Center in Amman for this final installment on a series marking the 20th anniversary of the US-led invasion of Iraq and its enduring humanitarian impacts. You'll be seeing more of me in just a little bit, but for now I'd like to thank the program and the Amman Center and turn things over to my colleague, Catherine McCann, a senior program officer at the Program on Forced Migration and Health, to introduce today's conversation and our fellow panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Azmat, and thank you to the Lee Center for hosting us today. As Azmat mentioned, my name is Catherine McCann, and I'm a Senior Program Officer at the Program on Forced Migration and Health. I'm joining you today on behalf of Monette Zard, Director of the program, who unfortunately can't be with us today. Today's event is the final in a series of 4 panels co-convened over the course of the year by Amman Global Center and the Program on Forced Migration and Health, marking the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War. This series has aimed to take stock of the enduring impact of the war on the humanitarian and geopolitical landscapes in the MENA region and globally. We began in April with an inaugural event featuring the speakers Fabrizio Carboni, Professor Les Roberts, and Zahar Muhammad Ali, who analyzed the impact of the humanitarian action framework adopted by the United States in the early 2000s, which saw the U.S. government increasingly and overtly link military and strategic objectives with the work of humanitarian and developmental NGOs, and raised profound questions around the principles of humanitarian independence and neutrality, and ushered in an area in which the lines between military and humanitarian operations have become increasingly blurred. The panel explored the implications of these trends over the last 2 decades, including the accelerating numbers of attacks on humanitarian workers by state and non-state actors, and the challenges to operational presence in humanitarian organizations in insecure settings. Our second event was held in June, and it brought together a panel of experts which included Dina Esfandiari, Professor Samiran Mako, and Dr. Ramad Mansour, to discuss and unpack the far-reaching geopolitical ramifications of the Iraq War, which have had a direct impact on the landscape of Iraqi politics, governance, and civil society. The panelists delved into the role of the post-2003 de-Baathification strategy and subsequent adoption of ethno-sectarianism on Iraq's political landscape, and they explored the emergence of collective solidarities aimed at addressing grievances and challenging power-sharing arrangements which have resulted in the current political deadlock in Iraq. The third panel, hosted last month, sought to articulate and explore the profound impact of counterterrorism measures that catalyzed by the 9/11 attacks and the subsequent invasion of Iraq. We were joined by the guest panelists Mohammed Mahmoud Mahamadou, Emma O'Leary, and Yelena Page, to discuss how the counterterrorism framework has impacted patterns of humanitarian aid and operations in humanitarian organizations, and the challenges of providing services within that context. The panelists highlighted the role of increasing regulations in limiting how and with whom humanitarian actors can work, and the impact this has had on the impartiality of aid, particularly in accessing particularly vulnerable and hard-to-reach populations. Recording of all 3 of these webinars can be found on the Program on Forced Migration and Health's website. Today, we are gathered for a final event of this series, which seeks to explore technology's influence on the nature of warfare and the humanitarian action. The invasion of Iraq marked the onset of a period characterized by swift advancements in military technology, resulting in a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare, with far-reaching effects on humanitarian action. The advancement of technology has ushered in a new phase of war strategy in which satellite surveillance, drones, precision munition, artificial intelligence, and other technologies increasingly complicate the nature of conflict and change the technology and change the experiences of civilians living in conflict zones. This panel will explore how technology has been harnessed in war, creating new vulnerabilities for civilians, while also offering innovative opportunities within humanitarian systems established to safeguard individuals exposed to conflict. And as we begin today, we are conscious that this discussion is taking place against a backdrop of a renewed and violent conflict that is challenging the fundamentals of humanitarian law and principles. Iraq shattered many long-held assumptions about the nature and role of humanitarian work, and the events currently unfolding in Gaza and in Israel are likely to do the same. It is with that in mind that I am profoundly grateful that we have with us 3 distinguished speakers, 2 in person and 1 online, who will lay a framework and help us navigate some of these challenges and questions. So joining us first today, as you already heard from, is Professor Azmat Khan. Azmat is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter at the New York Times whose work grapples with the human costs of war. She's also the Patty Cadby Birch Assistant Professor at the Columbia Journalism School and director of the Simon and June Lee Center for Global Journalism. Her multi-part series in the New York Times, The Civilian Casualty Files, was based on more than 5 years of reporting, including ground investigation at sites of more than 100 civilian casualty incidents in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. More than 1,300 formerly secret military records that she obtained in a legal battle with the Pentagon, and scores of interviews with military and legal sources. Azmat's investigations have prompted widespread policy impact and won more than 24 awards, including the 2022 Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting, 2 National Magazine Awards, 2 Overseas Press Club Awards, the Polk Award, and the Hillman Prize. Azmat will provide an overview of her work on the extensive use of drones in the U.S. war on terror. She will share with us some ideas and framing around technology and how technology is changing the nature of warfare itself, the impact on civilians, and the challenges around transparency and accountability. Next, we will be joined online by Belkis Willi, who is an Associate Director of the Crisis and Conflict Division at Human Rights Watch. In her previous role as a senior researcher within the division, she spearheaded the organization's work investigating the harm stemming from personal data collection, including biometrics, in humanitarian contexts. This work has included investigations in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Iraq, Jordan, and Kenya. She has also led the organization's work on the preservation of taken down social media content that is vital to war crimes investigations. Since February 2022, she has been documenting laws of war violations in Ukraine. Before taking up that role, Belkis worked as a Human Rights Watch senior Iraq researcher and as the Kuwait, Qatar, and Yemen researcher. She also previously worked for the World Organization Against Torture in Libya. Belkis will reflect on the themes of transparency and accountability and how this is challenged by new technology, and she will explore some of the risks associated with the collection of personal data in humanitarian contexts. Last, but certainly not least, we have joining us with us Laura Walker McDonald, a technologist, lawyer, and strategist with more than 15 years of global experience in aid and the development space. Laura currently serves as the Senior Advisor on Digital Technology and Data Protection for the Regional Delegation for the US and Canada for the International Committee of the Red Cross, where she advises on the impacts of technology on conflict, the conduct of hostilities and humanitarian action, and leads related policy, learning, and research initiatives. Before joining the ICRC, Laura was Senior Director of Impact and Outreach at the Digital Impact Alliance at the UN Foundation, where she led their policy, impact evaluation, community and communications team, as well as the principles for digital development. She has consulted widely on organizations around technology strategy, research, and practice. Laura will contextualize both the dangers and opportunities around the use of technology within the humanitarian sphere, and will outline how humanitarian organizations, such as the IRC, are preparing to meet those challenges. This panel today will run for about 1 hour, and then we'll have a little bit of chunk of time at the end for a Q&A. So for those online, please do put your questions into the box, and for those who will be joining us in person, you will have an opportunity to ask your questions live. And so with that, I will now pass it over to Azmat.
Well, thank you all so much again for being here. It's an honor to be here with these co-panelists who come from a variety of different disciplines. But today I'm going to be talking a little bit about this issue through the lens of journalism and some of my own work. And, you know, as has been mentioned, we've seen incredible transformations and advancements in technologies in recent years that have fundamentally transformed how we do warfare, and specifically how the United States, which often sets a standard that many world powers might follow, does warfare and includes these technologies. And so I do want to just hone in on one transformation that we've seen in recent years, which is that, you know, as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan took the toll of many Americans, you know, took the toll of those who were service members deployed abroad, that was very difficult for the American public. You know, seeing civilians who were also being killed in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, you know, certainly was something that animated the American public. But I would say it was loss of U.S. life that made sending boots on the ground in such large numbers something that the American public was not willing to always sign off on. And so an outcome of that political strain in the United States is that we shifted to an approach of warfare in which we deployed fewer American troops on the ground and instead primarily carried out a lot of these campaigns via air power. And that doesn't just mean drones, but it can mean B-52 bombers. It can mean incredible aircraft we saw from the Vietnam era being used in support of partner forces on the ground in many of these countries. And if you look at the kinds of technologies that were coming out of that, the numbers can be quite impressive. And so I just want to walk you through Operation Inherent Resolve, which was the US-led campaign against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And I remember when I first began investigating this, I was watching videos like this uploaded to YouTube by the US-led coalition, which was trying to counter ISIS propaganda of these incredible airstrikes. And at the same time that they were doing these incredible airstrikes that were resulting in so many deaths, they were also claiming very particular statistics. So this is just the front page of an International Herald Tribune article that I was on a flight, I was given on a flight, and it just states as fact that 25,000 ISIS fighters, this is in April of 2016, had been killed in the war against ISIS. And at the same time, because I'd also been tracking US claims about how many civilians had been killed, you know, I knew that the United States, which said every time there was an allegation of a civilian casualty in this war, that it would assess it, that they had assessed 21 civilian deaths. And if you know anything about numbers and the history of warfare and civilian casualties, these would not just be unprecedented, they would be next to impossible. So I want to take you through a little bit about why it's possible that those numbers are credible. And when you take a look at some of these videos, you can start to see the level of precision that the United States military can employ. You'll see here that they say they're striking a car bombing factory, a VBIED facility. And if you examine satellite imagery, you can see that they very precisely hit what they've identified as a car bombing factory. And you don't really see anything around it that was necessarily affected by it. So there's a level of precision weaponry that can be quite impressive. But this is the view you get from the air, right? It was very difficult for journalists to get to these sites on the ground. As you know, ISIS beheaded journalists, James Foley and others. These areas are risky to operate in. And ISIS also had a monopoly on the internet in many of these countries. They did not allow people to use cell phones and upload video footage. So unlike, for example, what we're seeing in Ukraine, which is a great deal of online content that made its way public, you did not see as much of that when it came to these wars in Iraq and Syria. So I just want to take you through, let's step away from this view from the air, and let's take a look at what that looks like on the ground. And let's go to Mosul, Iraq, maybe the city that I love most in the world. So this is an area of Mosul called the Woods, Rabat. It sits on the banks of the Tigris. It is a beautiful place. And I just want to introduce you to a single family and what they endured when the war against ISIS began, when ISIS took over and the war against ISIS began. So this is Bassem Razo. He was an engineer who was born and raised in Mosul, but was educated in the United States. And he lived with his wife, Mayada, his brother, Mohamed, his daughter, Tuka, and his nephew, Najib, in two homes they shared in Rabat, in the woods. And when ISIS took over, their lives dramatically changed. They found themselves, the women in particular, having to cover their faces, wear gloves. The men also had restrictions on their clothing. They had to cut their pants short. But ISIS, when it came in, it did a great deal of things to hurt civilians. They, as Bassem recounted to me, he watched Yazidis who were captured and enslaved and were being killed. He saw police officers of Mosul who were executed for having those backgrounds serving in the Iraqi government, and his own nephew, Najib, whom I'll introduce you to in just a second, who also found himself caught in the grip of ISIS. Now, this family, enduring all of that, primarily just stayed at home. They didn't leave the house. They tried to do what they were told to do in a time of warfare, which was to stay away from ISIS and to not attract attention to themselves. One day, Najib went out to buy dairy for breakfast, it was a cream for breakfast that they were going to eat. And on the way, ISIS stopped him because he was wearing a T-shirt with Western writing on it, as well as had a haircut that they deemed un-Islamic, and he was arrested and sentenced to 10 lashes and had his head shaved, and he came home to Bassem crying. So this family dealt with incredible hardships under ISIS, and they witnessed the killing of civilians. But I just want to take you forward a second. So this video that I showed you earlier, what was purported to be a car bombing factory. What I didn't tell you about this video is that it wasn't a car bombing factory. It was the homes of Bassem and his brother. So this could be incredibly precise. You can have incredible technologies that allow you to target a car bombing factory with incredible precision. Depending on a situation, there is that possibility. But if you have the wrong target, that precise technology no longer matters. Just want to go forward. This is Bassem and I, the first time he went back to his home. In September of 2015, he woke up in the middle of the night and he could see the stars above Mosul. The roof of his home was gone. And he called out for Mayada, his wife, and she didn't respond. And later, in a hospital bed, he learned that his daughter Tuka, who's pictured here actually the night before the airstrike, holding a firework, had been killed. That his wife Mayada had been killed. That his brother Mohamed had been killed. And that Najib, his nephew, had been killed. He also learned, not long after that the US-led coalition had uploaded a video of the airstrike that targeted what he knew to be his and his brother's homes, and called it a car bombing factory. His relatives left comments on the YouTube video asking, how could you do this? We are civilians. Bassem had a cousin-in-law who was a tenured professor at Yale who wrote an op-ed about what happened to her family, and their losses were not acknowledged. And as I got to know Bassem and investigate that strike, I really wanted to know, well, how often does this happen, and how correct or incorrect are the numbers the United States is claiming in this war? Because there was a campaign of tens of thousands of airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. And these claims of precision were not just reinforced by technology. They gave a kind of confidence to a narrative that allowed statistics like 25,000 ISIS fighters killed and 21 civilians to go unchecked. And so I wanted to do a ground sample. I wanted to know, is it possible to get to areas that have been retaken from ISIS and try to figure out how many airstrikes took place and how many civilians were killed? And so I wound up doing a cluster-based sample in 3 parts of northern Iraq. Qayyara, which is an urban city not far from Erbil. Shora, which is a kind of suburban small town, and the Aden district of East Mosul. And I went door to door in these places, interviewing survivors. Hold on just a second. Documenting where airstrikes took place, which were airstrikes and which were, for example, local detonations by ISIS or by individuals who live there, places where ISIS had operated. And I would cross-check a lot of this with what open source material there was, with satellite imagery. Just a second. This is, I also flew, it was actually a lot of work to fly a drone in some of these areas where airwaves are scrambled, you can't actually do this, but to try to document what these look like from above, what we could see about each of these places. And, I dug through rubble, looking for any evidence of civilian life or of ISIS use. I tried analyzing munitions by going to experts. So for example, in the center and right here, those are 2 parts of missile fragments recovered at the site of Bassem Razzo's home. I interviewed survivors. I'm sorry, these images are a little graphic, but that is the nature of war reporting. And they're important to see. I documented people's injuries. I collected their ID cards, and people were incredibly forthcoming. They wanted their losses acknowledged. And I took all of this information, which I'll just, I took photos of areas that had been hit. This is a young girl named Rawa, actually, who was the lone survivor of an airstrike that killed her family in Qayyara. She was the only one who lived. Her mother died on the way to the hospital. And like I mentioned, I would verify the dates and locations of these airstrikes. So I used a lot of different tools. And now if you, give me just one second. Here we go. And I built a database of those strikes. Engaged in it. I worked with a sociologist to do like a full methodology and peer review. I wound up going to more than 103 airstrikes in this sample of those 3 areas. And I just want to give you, the outcome was a story called The Uncounted, but I just want to give you a little bit of these findings. So if you analyzed the coalition's press releases, 1 in 157 airstrikes would have resulted in a civilian death, if you believe the government's numbers, which is a civilian casualty rate of 0.06%. What we found on the ground was 1 in 5. That's not 2 times higher. That's not 3 times higher. That's 31 times higher than what our government claimed. And because of the areas we sampled and the places we went and the deaths I didn't count. For example, I didn't count the children of ISIS fighters whose details I couldn't confirm. We believe this 1 in 5 to be an undercount. It did not include West Mosul or Raqqa in this original investigation, And yet we found the rate of civilian death was 31 times higher than what our government told us. And yet, claims of transformations of technology and precision made it possible for statistics to go unchecked for so long. This work continued for years, and I'm going to show you at that point it was hard to attribute causes, right? I actually embedded with the US military in Qatar, the nerve center of the air campaign, had them walk me through, interviewed a dozen or so officials who worked in different aspects of this air campaign, had me walk through how they target, how they do pattern of life assessments, how they vet their intelligence, how they respond when there's a claim of a civilian casualty. And then I turned over every single coordinate in that sample of 103 airstrikes and asked them to check whether or not they did them. And they would provide me with a short response about what they believed they were targeting, if they believed it likely that they conducted an airstrike. And from that, half of the civilian casualty incidents that we found, we believed that poor or outdated intelligence appeared to be the cause. So for example, with Bassem Razo, it appeared that the cause in that case was bad intelligence, right? They had conflated his house with an ISIS target. In about a third of those civilian casualty incidents, it appeared that, for example, Shora Primary School, which was being used by militants, but there were people walking by when it was struck and were killed. That was considered proximity. We called it proximity. Some might call it so-called collateral damage. There are reasons, but I think that term is not necessarily worth using in the context of what it truly means. And then about 17% appeared to be near a target, where ISIS may have functioned or operated, but did not hit it, and instead hit that civilian home. So with Bassem and the Razo family, I wound up requesting, the government it tells us we investigate all of these incidents, we assess them. And using the Freedom of Information Act and a sort of creative argument for expedited processing, basically arguing it's not just about public interest, it's about potential harm to the subject of these records if you don't release them to me. Like he could be accused of being ISIS because of this video that you've put up. I was able to get it rather quickly, and what I found within it was pretty stunning. I'm just, normally I would walk you through what some of these terms mean. A max slant of 700, that means they observed using full motion video, FMV, this area, and noted a maximum of 7 men, 0 women, and 0 children. That's what a slant means. And if you read through it, they said there were no women or children observed at this house, even though they filmed during the hottest hours of day when women or children wouldn't be outside, but it also just made it possible that the only evidence of civilian life would be the presence of a woman or child. They said that there were no weapons visible, but, quote, ICE does not obviously brandish weapons so as to go undetected. They said they saw no overtly nefarious activity. They saw Bassem opening the gate for Mohammed when he would be driving home, and vice versa. And they saw that as a tactic, technique, and procedure used by ISIS, opening and closing a gate. They also said this after the Kabul strike when I got my hands on that document as well. But my personal favorite is that they said that, well, we may have confused these two structures with a compound next door, which had been used by ISIS but had been left a few weeks earlier. So when I got my hands on that document, I wanted the others. I knew that there were thousands of others. And so if I just move forward, I took these press releases that I mentioned in which they say, whether they found a report credible or not. I built a database of them. I began requesting them through the Freedom of Information Act. And I sued the US military, both the Department of Defense and US Central Command, to obtain more than 1,300 of them, and built a database that I analyzed, and even brought on some of my conflict reporting students to join in that analysis. And I just want to give you a brief overview of what I found. In those 1,300 assessments in which the US military says that they have investigated or assessed claims of civilian casualties, in not one was there a finding of wrongdoing or disciplinary action for anyone involved. There was only one possible violation of the rules of engagement, There were multiple instances of confirmation bias, which we can talk about later. Efforts to identify root causes or lessons learned were rare, and there was almost no ground investigation or interviews with survivors. There were only 2 cases where they did that. One is this major civilian casualty incident in an area of West Mosul called Mosul Jadida that killed, the US-led coalition has admitted more than 100. Other estimates are as high as 200. And they did go to that site and investigate on the ground. They did not interview any survivors in that. And there's another instance in which they tried to collect intelligence with recent refugees at a camp. And in talking to them to try to find ISIS targets, people mentioned there had been a civilian casualty incident. So those are the 2 cases where they either visited on the ground or interviewed survivors. In some of the documents, they would give detail like this about what they believe they were targeting, a chemical weapons facility. I'm not going to get into these details. I could talk about them at great length, but I know that we are limited for time. But in this case, there was a USAID official who happened to be in the room when the strike was being authorized, who was the only person who dissented in that room and said, I think if we conduct this airstrike, we're going to kill 10 children. Because the children that we saw in our surveillance footage, you think that they don't live near this target. Knowing what I do about ground realities, I think that they do. And I think you might kill 10 children. And that was ignored. The strike was carried out at night when they believed the children's that they'd classified as transients, not local to that particular area, wouldn't be around. And days later, pictures of dead children surfaced online. More than 21 people were killed from a single family. And, I've interviewed survivors from it. I visited that site. And a father told me he recognized his 6-year-old daughter, Sosan, only by the purple dress that she'd been wearing, that he'd given her just not long before this airstrike. This is Rozkaya. She went looking for her son. He'd left the house one day to go get a wheat grinder. Mosul, West Mosul in this case, was under siege, and there was no food, and they wanted wheat. They wanted to turn wheat into flour so they could eat. And he went out with his trusty red cart, and he didn't return. The story she told me was that, by afternoon when he hadn't come back, she was in a panic, and she went out looking for him. She went to morgues, hospitals. She did this for a month and 2 days. Hajia, we don't have your son, morgue workers would tell her. She was barefoot. She refused to leave the neighborhood in case he might come back. And weeks later, somebody asked her at a pharmacy, did you find your son? And she said no, and they said, go to this area, because they found a cart there. She goes there, and it's his trusty red cart, and she learns from people who were witnesses that he was killed. There was an airstrike on an ISIS mortar position, and he happened to be walking by at the time. And this is the document that I obtained that matched what locals told me when I did not give them this document. They describe an ISIS mortar position, a man walking by who was struck by ejecta from the blast and did not get up with a cart, a man with a cart. I can't talk about this incident because I will not cry today. But you can listen to an episode of The Daily from January, I think 18th, 2022, that delves into great detail about this young girl who is the lone survivor of an airstrike that killed her family members, and her grandmother who has to live with those losses. And you know what I learned later about that, which is that the target it appeared they were looking for was across the street, an ISIS bed-down location. They'd actually seen children on the roof of the home they targeted, on the roof of the structure they targeted before this airstrike, and then changed their assessment about what it was. It was no longer a place where ISIS fighters slept. They deemed it an ISIS weapons manufacturing facility, which made the possible deaths of 3 children proportional to the military advantage gained. And you can learn more about what I uncovered as I investigated that if you read the New York Times Magazine or listen to that episode of The Daily. This is a young boy named Hassan. He was injured in an airstrike that targeted a notorious ISIS recruiter named Neil Prakash. According to the records I obtained, Neil Prakash was killed. A few months after this airstrike, Neil Prakash was found alive and well crossing from Syria into Turkey. He was not killed in this incident, but 4 civilians were injured or killed. This is an example remarkably similar to the Kabul strike. These are photos taken by Ivor Prickett for the New York Times Magazine. You can read more of these, you can see more of these. I want to talk about each of these people, but I want to be very respectful to my co-panelists, so I would just encourage you to read, watch, and listen to these stories from the civilian casualty files, because I think they're a great grounding in the understandings of what it's like for civilians in wartime, what it means to investigate death tolls, and how you go about doing that, in open source tools that you can use to help verify things. And mainly, especially for the journalists in the room, in how to bring humanity to the stories you're covering and not flatten the voices of people who are on the receiving end of this. So I'm just going to stop there. You can read the uncounted. This kind of reporting did lead to different kinds of changes, but whether or not those are effective is a different story. But I'd encourage you to explore the records. More than 1,300 of them have been made public. And I would encourage you to be skeptical journalists who, when wars are taken in your name, whether that's by the United States, whether that's by a foreign military, to bring your investigative prowess to those subjects, to truly try to understand whether claims of technology and precision have the impacts that we are told they do. And what you'll find also, if you look historically at past wars, whether that's the Gulf War, or the Vietnam War, you'll find claims of precision and new technologies in each of those as well. So I'm just going to stop there and turn it back over to Catherine. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Asmat. Your reflections are incredibly sobering, and thank you for sharing them and for all of the work that you have done in uncovering some of these issues. It certainly gives us, I think I can speak for everyone in the room in saying it gives us a lot to think about related to how we conceptualize accountability in war, particularly in a setting where we know that misinformation and disinformation is so rampant, and when you reflect on the impact that poor intel can have on the lives of civilians. So thank you. Our next panelist that we'll be going to will be Balkis, who will be speaking some on the use of humanitarian and the risks of using tech in humanitarian settings for beneficiaries of services. Balkis, over to you.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I wish I was there in person. I'm actually in Ukraine at the moment. As was said, I'm based in Ukraine, but very happy to speak, particularly given the relationship between this discussion today and Iraq, a country that I have covered for Human Rights Watch for many years and is very near and dear to me. And I thought perhaps I would start with talking about something else that was happening in Iraq. This predates a little bit the period that Asmat is describing, but has continued to today. And that is something that really began soon after the US invasion of Iraq. Soon after that invasion, the US military decided to start collecting biometrics, photographs, fingerprints, iris scans of many people in Iraq, and it did the same in Afghanistan. Initially, it started by collecting the biometrics of people that were sitting in prison, people that were wanted by the US military and local authorities. And then they decided to expand the system that they were building, and they built a database that would not only house the biometrics of people who were wanted or in prison, but indeed people who were working with and for the US military and the US government more generally. And they built these what ended up being these vast databases that contained a lot of information about people, including why they might have been in prison or wanted, or indeed what role they were playing working with or for the US government or military. In the case of Iraq, what happened over the years was that the Iraqi government got quite interested in this database that the Americans had built and decided it wanted to build its own. It framed it as ultimately what became a unified national ID system. It started unrolling this in around 2015. So that's the point in the story where we get closer to the period that Asmat was describing. And it started rolling out from area to area of the country, a system where now when people were renewing their national ID cards, and in Iraq, and everyone carries around at least 4 ID at any one time, a ration card, a family ID card, an individual ID card, and sometimes several more. And the idea was to provide everyone with this unified national ID card that was based on biometrics. What also happened at the same time was that parts of the Iraqi government, indeed particularly the Ministry of Interior, started to have more ties to and more influence by armed militia groups. And that unfortunately continues to be the case today. There are armed militias that are linked to the Ministry of Interior, the Minister of Interior, and these groups have played a role for many years. They played a role in the battles against ISIS, the very battles that Asmat was describing. And some of you may remember in 2019, the large-scale protests that took hold in Baghdad, and even in 2018 in the south of Iraq. And there, what we saw was that these militias played a core role in targeting protesters, sometimes hunting them down in the streets at the protests, sometimes at their own homes, and in many cases killing them. And what we have been suspecting for a long time as Human Rights Watch is that these militia groups seem to have extensive access to the personal details of the people that they were hunting down. And what we've now been digging into for over 2 years is trying to figure out the extent to which these militia groups have actually had access to the biometric profiles of Iraqi nationals, profiles built by this national ID system, and they can actually use that to hunt people down and target them. This is new research that Human Rights Watch is doing. We haven't published on this yet, but I can say that we found a lot of evidence to show that these militia groups have direct access into government systems, including biometric ID systems. They're very dangerous, as you can imagine, when this extensive personal data is in the hands of an armed militia group that is trying to exact punishment against individuals when it doesn't like their behavior. And I think what perhaps is even more dangerous, and this then bridges to the humanitarian space, is that at the same time that we've had this development, you have UN agencies that are coming in to support the Iraqi government, helping with, for example, providing rations to Iraqi nationals, and a range of other systems where you have UN funding going towards government services. And UN agencies are actually piggybacking off these biometric ID systems that the government has built that are also being used at the same time by armed groups to target individuals. And you have donor interest, international donor countries that actually want to fund these systems. And I think what we've seen with real concern is particularly an interest from the European Union. And some of you might wonder why the European Union would be interested in funding the Iraqi national unified ID system. But when you start to zoom out and look at other countries where the EU has already done this, it has funded a national biometric ID system in a country like Senegal and in Cote d'Ivoire. And in those cases, it was directly related to a desire on the side of EU member states to be able to more easily deport people that are caught in Europe illegally. If you have a fingerprint scan, if you have an iris scan of someone that's been detained, and you can match them to a biometric profile in their country of origin, it becomes much easier to return them to that country. Whereas if you didn't have any information about them, if they don't have a passport and they can't show you any paperwork, it's harder to deport people. So this has become an actual strategy on the externalization of EU borders, using biometric ID systems as a way of deporting people. Now, let's jump to Afghanistan. And as I mentioned, when the US military was building out these databases of biometric IDs of Iraqis, it was doing the same with regards to Afghans. After several years of this, a range of different donors came in, both donor states and UN agencies, to help the Afghan government to build out more biometric systems, mostly related to payroll. So a biometric system that would handle the payroll of all staff working in the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Defense, even the judicial sector. And the idea was that this was a way to ensure that there weren't so-called ghost workers, that people who were receiving salaries were real workers for that ministry, and in order to also, vet individuals. What, of course, all of you know very well is that the Taliban, after many years, re-exerted control over Kabul. And when it re-exerted control over Kabul, one of the first things that Taliban fighters did was take control of certain key ministries. And in those ministries, they got hold of servers full of the data of Afghan nationals. And that is data, again, that was collected and paid for to a large extent by the donor community. And subsequently, we've seen that the Taliban has actually used this data to target individuals. Now, if the Taliban wants to target former government officials, police, those in the Afghan military formerly, they have a very easy way of doing this. If any individual now comes in to apply for a passport in the passport office in Kabul and scans their fingerprint, the Taliban will immediately know if this person used to be an Iraqi police officer or in the military. And I've spent a lot of time in the aftermath of the Taliban takeover of Kabul interviewing people who were in hiding across the country, saying, they were too scared to leave the house that they were staying in because there was a checkpoint nearby. And they had heard, and in one case actually saw, that Taliban fighters at that checkpoint actually had an old US iris scanning machine that they were using to scan people's irises to see if they got a match in the US military database that was still accessible to a certain extent on these devices in order to detain individuals. Now I'm going to move to a third example. And this is one that really even more squarely fits into the humanitarian space. As many of you will remember, there was a huge outflow of Rohingya individuals from Myanmar to Bangladesh. And once the Bangladeshi government realized that there was, a large-scale population of Rohingya in the country, in 2018, they asked UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, to come in and register the Rohingya population. UNHCR did this, telling the Rohingya population that they were registering them in order to provide them with identity documents that would also allow individuals to get access to aid and a range of other assistance that the Bangladeshi government was providing. What they didn't tell the Rohingya clearly at the time was that the Bangladeshi authorities would be handing all of that data over to the Myanmar government, the very government that these individuals had fled from after mass atrocities, including burning of their villages, mass killings, and rape. And some Rohingya were actually quite suspicious of the registration exercise. They protested, saying, "We're very worried that if our data is being collected by UNHCR or by the Bangladeshi government, it might end up in the hands of Myanmar." And they were told resoundingly over and over again, "Don't worry, that's not going to happen." What we, in our investigation, were able to demonstrate was that UNHCR knew going into the registration exercise that the one purpose of data collection was to hand that over to Bangladesh in order for it to be handed over to Myanmar. And as some of you may know, who've been following recent events in the region, is that Bangladeshi authorities and the Myanmar military have been in talks very recently to start essentially sending back the Rohingya to Myanmar, in many cases against their will, And one way that this is going to be facilitated, made much easier, is because they have the biometric profiles of everyone who is registered in Bangladesh. These are 3 case studies that really touch on a much bigger problem, which is the way that biometric data has been pounced on by the humanitarian community, by the donor community. It's seen as this sort of silver bullet. The feeling is that it's the one way to address fraud in the humanitarian sector. If you have someone's fingerprint, you can be sure that it's them that picks up the bag of rice that was intended for them and not their brother or their cousin or a friend. And that it's efficient, it's quick, it's easy. A fingerprint scan is far quicker in the field than looking at someone's identity card if they have one, or trying to come up with a workaround if they don't have an identity document. Now, whether or not it might increase efficiency and whether or not it might be a way of preventing certain aspects of fraud, the risks are so incredibly great that I think, what we hope is that the humanitarian sector really takes pause when they think about integrating these kind of technologies into aid distribution, and that potentially there's a decision that, the risk of harm is simply too great to prioritize fraud prevention and efficiency over, what can ultimately be the lives of people. As I said, the Afghans that I was speaking to are at risk of being killed simply because their biometric profile is in the hands of the Taliban. So I'll stop there, and I really look forward to handing over to my colleague from the ICRC, an organization that I think has really held the gold standard when it comes to the issues that I've been speaking about. That is the most restrictive organization globally in the aid sector when it comes to the collection and use of biometrics, and really is I think, our staunchest ally when it comes to the protection of personal data. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Belkis. Thank you for joining us from Ukraine. Your case studies really capture and highlight some of these risks that we're seeing with the use of technology, even as reliance on technology is increasing and becoming more widespread. I want to save as much time as we can for Q&A, so I'm going to hand right over to Laura to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll save about 10 minutes for Q&A. So please do if you're online, put your questions in the chat, and if you are in person, be thinking about jumping onto that microphone. We'll try to save as much time as we can.
Well, thank you for the invitation to join you all on such an incredible panel. And thank you, Belkis, for the very kind words. I'm very proud, and as I sit here in front of you all, somewhat relieved about our very restrictive biometrics policy after that introduction from you. And I can come back to that in a minute, because I think it's a really good example of how we think about technology in our work. So this is not the first time that ICRC has been present during this series, and we thank you for that also. So I want to ask those in the room if you've heard of the ICRC. Perhaps you've heard of us from a previous speaker. I've got some nods. The ICRC is the International Committee of the Red Cross. I assume most people here will have heard of the Red Cross. Lots of nods. So the International Committee of the Red Cross is a weird part of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. And I started my career at the British Red Cross, which is one of our national societies. We have a very large national society here in America, the American Red Cross. And there are now 190 national societies all around the world, including the Ukrainian Red Cross and the Russian Red Cross, also the Magen David Adom in Israel, and the Palestinian Red Crescent, all of whom are crucial partners to us in current conflicts. And I'm sure in recent months and years, you've had maybe more occasion to learn about the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement and the particular role that the ICRC plays. We are 160 years old this year. We're the original Swiss independent organization that was set up in the wake of a book called A Memory of Solferino, which is written by Henri Dunant. And he had the experience during the Franco-Prussian War. It's an entertaining story involving a nighttime carriage ride chasing after an emperor. I'm not kidding, look it up. But what it led to was him stumbling across a battlefield and seeing that on both sides, soldiers were wounded, and going to a nearby village, the village of Solferino, and getting the villagers to help whoever the people were, and gathering messages from those soldiers, sending them home to their families, providing first aid. And then he went back to Geneva and said, okay, we need this for real. We need an institution who can go out and help people who are affected by conflict, whoever they are, on the basis of need. And here we are 160 years later. We have the national societies, we have the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross. We're still operating in 100 countries around the world. And we also have the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, which coordinates our responses to other emergencies, including natural disasters and health emergencies. So we're a big organization, and I'm very proud to be part of the movement. I work for the regional delegation for the US and Canada down in Washington, D.C. We do also have a delegation here in New York. So that's a little bit about us. I wanted to also share a little bit about our operation in Iraq, which is 40 years old, actually 43 years old this year, because it was set up in the early moments of the Iran-Iraq war. The work that we do in Iraq really shows and spans the sort of the gamut of the work that the ICRC now does. We obviously provide assistance and support to people who are affected by the conflict. One of the things I mentioned earlier is taking those messages back to the families of people who are affected by conflict. That's the Red Cross messages. We still reunite families. We, across the movement, reunite 12 families every day. But less known about is that we also work to help families find out the fate of the missing. And there are many people around the world for whom that is a critical element of recovery and closure. And that's something that we do in Iraq as well. Iraq is very seriously contaminated by the explosive remnants of war, and also chemical areas where chemicals have affected the soil, and we seek to raise awareness of that, and also do extensive work supporting people who've been hurt by the explosive remnants of war as well, prosthetics and things like that. And we help strengthen the health system's response for people with disabilities as well. And there's some really wonderful work that some of our health centers do for folks who are affected by with disabilities because of the conflict. One other sort of slightly, you might not think of the ICRC as being one of these actors, but we do also help to repair infrastructure which has been severely degraded by the conflict. And an example of that is water, which, as you may know, is a really increasingly critical issue in Iraq, exacerbated by climate change, also a consequence and a driver of conflict and instability in the region. And so with other institutional partners, we help to rehabilitate the water system. That doesn't sound that glamorous, but it's a critical civilian need, as we've had occasion to relearn repeatedly in recent conflicts. And then an important element of our work is to remind authorities of their obligations under international humanitarian law. And I'm gonna come back to that, because we do a lot more and more work every year on the role that technologies play in conflict. That's always been part of the ICRC's role. If you think back to after the First World War, reflecting on the role that chemical weapons played after the First and Second World War, urging the prohibition, calling for the prohibition and banning of chemical weapons, and then helping to strengthen and create those norms over the years that have followed, is an example of the ICRC identifying a new technology that was incredibly harmful to anybody who came into contact with it, and urging states to come together and agree that that was a line that we would draw in the spirit of the preservation of humanity in war, which I think, as we've heard today, is not really possible, but that's the pursuit that we're in, is to try to preserve humanity in war. And one of the ways we do that is with the international humanitarian law and the body of customary law around it. When it comes to new technologies, we have a responsibility to follow what is coming. Quantum computing, biotechnologies, human augmentation, all of these things are things, unfortunately, I had to follow and try and figure out what they mean for us and for the future of conflict. Because we need to be able to help raise questions for states. And AI is another example of a technology where the ICRC has invested considerable. Cyber operations is another one, where we've invested considerable time trying to understand how states are using these technologies in conflict, how they come up in conflict, and then help with states develop the law to clarify how it applies, because it almost always does apply. The existing law applies to these new technologies, to interpret them and to help states understand how to stay in compliance with international humanitarian law. This sounds really dry, I'm aware. But what it means in practice is, for example, that, when we think about the use of automated drones in conflict, there is an interpretation of the law that says that a human must always make the decision and that it cannot be automated. So when you are using explosive munitions, you always have to have a human in the loop. That's IHL. And that means that the decisions that, however flawed they are made by humans still. And that, in this day and age, is actually that's not technologically required anymore, but it is the law. So that's an example, and that's a huge area of our work. However, when I usually tell the story, I usually start with civilians, because people are at the center of what we're trying to do here. And so a huge part of my background, I am a lawyer, actually. I'm not the ICRC's lawyer. I'm a technologist for the ICRC. And so what I really try and where I come from is thinking about how people use technology and how technology works on people and communities. So I like to say that all humans at this point are digital or technological actors in their own right, and technology is part and parcel not only of how states wage war, but also how people seek to cope with them, and how people lead their everyday lives. So we've heard a lot recently about internet shutdowns in conflict and the consequences of those for keeping in touch with loved ones, but also for understanding how to stay safe, where to get assistance, how and when to evacuate if that becomes necessary. So connectivity itself is an example of how civilians are online, making their own decisions, gathering their own information, and whether or not states supply that is part of the, or prevent access to connectivity is part of the story here. Mis and disinformation and hate speech in the environment is another example of how technology is just in the water now. It's just in the air that we breathe. It's everywhere. And while mis and disinformation, people can be very discerning, even a small amount of disinformation that is known to be happening can pollute the information environment such that people lose trust in it. And then, again, it's harder for them to discern useful, life-saving humanitarian information that they need to keep safe. So these are all elements of how we think about technology. Digital cash increasingly is an element of this as well. We actually use digital cash in Iraq to provide assistance to people directly using their bank accounts. And that's quite a common humanitarian practice now. Something I want to raise, though, is, as Belkis was mentioning, the way that humanitarians use technology to provide assistance is a critical element of this whole playing field, and we have to think very carefully about it. I think digital cash is one example of where you are usually working with more and more these days, traditional banking authorities. But it might be more informal. It might be a sort of voucher-based or card-based system that has its own currency that only operates within a camp or something. Whatever we're doing, we're generating data about people. We're registering them somehow. We're tying an identity of some sort or other, not necessarily a legal identity, but an identity of some sort to an account, which then has a spending behavior. And however much of that data you retain, that's data that you can use, but it's also data that somebody else could use. That, coming back to biometrics, is at the root of our biometrics policy that basically says that currently the reason to use biometrics is exactly what Belkis said, is to reduce duplication of aid, diversion of aid, which is when aid is used by people who it wasn't intended for, sometimes which can feed the war machine, as we learned to our cost many decades ago, and to make sure that the aid goes to the people who need it. But it also is an immutable, which means it doesn't change, very personal, unique identifier of an individual, and once you let that out of the bottle, you can't put it back. And what we have observed, and what Belkis has been talking about, is that that data can be transferred to other people, and then even if not at that moment, but then in subsequent years, administrations change, governments change, and once that data is held by someone, it doesn't go away, and because it's biometrics, it's immutable, it doesn't change. So that individual is always tied to that biometric. It's very difficult to change that. So we feel essentially that the reasons to use biometrics are never outweighed at the moment by the potential negative impact for communities, and so we don't do it. So we're looking into ways to minimize the data that we gather when we use biometrics. So for example, if you did a token-based biometric system, so I have a card in my hand, I go up to a merchant and hand them the card, and then show my fingerprint. The fingerprint is in the card. If the two match, the card works and the balance can be used. If they don't, it can't. But that fingerprint is not on a database, it's just on the card, which I control. So the machine that the merchant has, you're the merchant, just in case that was confusing, just has a yes/no answer. It doesn't have the data itself. That's all on the card. So that's something that that's a ways off, but that's one way that we're trying to balance the need to deliver aid, deliver it swiftly, and to people who may not have a legal identity, it can be quite helpful to just use your biometrics, but we don't think that it is justifiable. And then finally, I just wanted to mention, in present-day Iraq, there has been a lot of digital transformation investment. I've come from a digital transformation background with the UN Foundation. That's what I was working on. And I do feel considerable disquiet about some of this investment because, as I said, governments can change, administrations can change, policies can change, and then you've invested in a system that might be used to target people. One of the things that we observe in present-day Iraq is that some of this digital transformation has gone to invest in things like the mobile networks, and it's impressive. 40 million people are online. It's pretty good coverage. But what we have observed is that some of that infrastructure is controlled by different actors, and the government, the central government, then reacts in different ways. For example, by constraining or shutting down some of those other networks. If you're a civilian who lives in one of the areas is mostly covered by a network that's just been shut down, you have all those challenges. If you're a humanitarian who is operating in that kind of context, then you can't check where your people are, you can't communicate with them, you can't communicate with your beneficiaries, with the people you're trying to seek to help. They can't communicate with you. And it's also possible that by using those networks, it might politicize you. So we also have to think about one of the very important things about the ICRC and about many humanitarians as we operate neutrally and impartially and independently. And we rely on trust of other actors in order to be able to access the populations we're helping. So if we appear to be less independent and neutral because of the networks that we are using or because of the technology that we're using, then that might impact on our neutrality and our ability to access populations. So technology for us in all of these ways, new technologies on the battlefield, the way that communities use and are used by technologies, and also how it impacts our humanitarian nature and very operational reality, create just a very complicated picture that we're trying to see through just as much as everyone else. And we really, really benefit from the important work that you all do to help us think these issues through. With that, thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I think you have very thoroughly underscored the challenge that the humanitarian sphere is facing in trying to navigate technology in the years that currently and in the years that come. I do want to open now to the Q&A, so please feel free to step up to the question box, put your questions into the comments. While everyone is getting settled to ask their questions, I do want to briefly turn back to Azmat and to Balkis with a question of my own, and that is, you both mentioned how technology, so the risks and dangers of technology, but also, Azmat, I was struck by your use of a drone to develop evidence for technology. And I want to, when we hear so much of the negatives around technology, I want to leave space for recognizing some of the possible opportunities that have been created through the use of tech. So I'll pass to you.
Hear Balkis on this issue, but I'll very quickly just talk about open source intelligence techniques and tools. OSINT reporting, as it's often called, and it's not just journalism, it permeates the legal sphere, it permeates human rights work, and there are incredible teams especially at Human Rights Watch, that do this work as well. And I will say that, there are, with all of the troubling hubris that can come from advancements in technology, there are also opportunities for you to leverage them in your work. There are many things you can do with a drone when it's not armed. But there are many things that, satellite imagery can do when there's equitable access to it. And I'll share on my Instagram stories later today some links to some of those tools just to be mindful of time and get to questions and turn it over to Belkis.
Thanks so much. And I think it is a really good and important question. At Human Rights Watch, the way we think of that is that we have sort of two pillars to our work in this space. One is on tech, where we're documenting technology being used to perpetrate and further abuse, and then separately with tech, which is when we're using technology to carry out human rights investigations. As Matt was saying, there's huge value to analysis of satellite imagery as long as you said, it's equitably accessible. I think ultimately there are certain tech tools that we could use that we don't for ethical reasons. And I think with regards to the journalism space, with human rights organizations, it's really important that as we engage with and use technological tools, we do so in an ethical and thought through manner. For example, I've seen some media outlets, for example, using facial recognition to analyze CCTV camera footage. For example, most recently, the BBC did this related to a story on the October 7th attacks in Israel. They ran the face of some of the attackers through facial recognition programming to identify the individuals who were depicted. And I think, there are real ethical questions around that. That is a technique that Human Rights Watch would not use at present. We don't think it's ethical to do so, even though, of course, one can see that, there's real value to identifying perpetrators and holding perpetrators accountable. So I think, as technology develops, as each new technology becomes a potential addition to our toolkit, we really need to think of the ethics around whether we engage with it, and if we do, how we do so thoughtfully and in a way that does more good than harm.
Thank you. And next, we'll move to some questions in the room. Just to make sure we can get through as many questions as possible, we're going to take 2 or 3 and then leave it up to our panelists.
Hi, thank you very much. I have a question for Human Rights Watch on Afghanistan, and that is, from what I understand, there's a lot of special immigration visa applicants left in Afghanistan, so people who supported the US war effort, and they also need to travel abroad to have their applications processed. So have you found any evidence of these people being caught up in the biometrical database built by the US? And have you found any evidence of people being caught up in the databases built by these digital money transfer systems?
Thank you. And we'll take 2 more questions and then turn to the panelists.
Hi, I'm Wishika. Thank you so much for this. I think my one question was, amidst all of this, what is the role of the UN and the UN peacekeeping forces in conflict today over the years? How have we seen those forces being used? Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for being here. My name is Sama. I was wondering about the cutoff of internet access and how that affects all of the work that all 3 of you do, and like specifically like aerial footage and how that's kind of diminishing in the context of Gaza.
Thank you. Belkis, we'll turn to you first.
Sure, I'm happy to take some of that, and I'll do so very briefly. Specifically on Afghanistan and people who are trying to travel, as you said, could potentially get resettled abroad because of the work that they did for foreign states and how that puts them at risk. Practically all of them are caught up in what I described, because they need a valid passport in order to be able to try to travel and leave Afghanistan. And in order to get that valid passport from the Taliban authorities, they need to go to a passport office and they need to scan a fingerprint. And as such, if their fingerprint shows up in a database that shows that they held a profession that is seen as, against Taliban policy and of a group that the Taliban is targeting, they will be too scared to go and get that passport. So this is something that has wide-ranging effect. When it comes to money transfers, that's not something that I've been following as closely or know as much about. But again, I think the concerns would be very similar. I'll just get to the last question because I'm not an expert on peacekeeping operations, but just to say, internet cutoffs on the one hand, have a huge impact on the work that we do documenting human rights abuses. So much of the evidence that we analyze nowadays is coming from people posting photos and videos online. And the minute an area gets cut off to internet access, it means that the voices of people are cut off. And, governments have figured this out. So when governments, armed forces decide to launch operations that might have large-scale human rights abuses tied to them, they often will shut off the internet before doing so, or while doing so, in order to silence those voices. And finally, what you also touched on, which is slightly different but also relevant, is satellite imagery. And there was a period of time when satellite imagery was cut off for most users who buy from certain commercial satellite imagery companies over Gaza. And that's still the case for at least one company. They're not giving out images anymore. But that also for a brief time was the case when it came to images over Ukraine. And that is going to continue to become more and more of a contentious issue, I think, with governments trying to actually stop investigators from getting access to accurate real-time satellite imagery in order to track abuse.
Nice try. Sama, that's a really important question. So there is a real and dangerous threat to credible, free flow of information out of Gaza right now. And that is, in part, it's about the internet. It's about blocking access to it. It's about what lines have been cut. And it's also about heroic workers who've gone to great lengths in the middle of a war zone to restore access when possible. It's about the lack of access to outside journalists and the resulting asymmetry in coverage, meaning that Gazan journalists who are doing extraordinary reporting at great personal risk, are dying and being injured in numbers that are unprecedented, are telling these stories, and they're competing with Western correspondents who have been dispatched to the region and are reporting from Israel. And there's a real asymmetry in Western news coverage when you're looking at this. And at the same time, there are these deaths of journalists. CPJ's own numbers, and there are other numbers that are even higher than this, but I'll just start with their numbers. I think the last I checked, they've assessed that 39 journalists have been killed in this conflict, 36 of whom are Palestinian. Other estimates are even higher than that. And they've said that in any 4-week period, they've never seen such a toll of journalists. And it's not just about them dying in these large numbers and this lack of access, it's also about the very fact that their integrity is being questioned, that their objectivity is being questioned. And as journalists, I have observed a lack of solidarity and consistency from many of the institutions that are sacred to journalism, with some exceptions, of course. And I think Columbia just put out a letter today that you can find talking about what this means for the flow of information and threats to a free press. But it's also then about, to bring it back to technology, it's also about the very fact that when these reports do come out, when Gazan journalists, many of whom I know you're probably following on social media, make these reports, that there are instances of being shadow banned. It happened to me, but forget me, I'm no one. Here are people who are risking their lives to tell these stories. I think there's a story on my IG feed right now about someone who was recent in Gaza who was shadow banned in the last few days, whose work is not reaching audiences on social platforms, whose work and incredible sacrifices to tell these stories is not being heard. So yes, there's cut off to internet, there's cut off in internet access, there's asymmetries in coverage, but then it's also just about reach and distribution models in an era of journalism in which so often people are not seeking out things. It comes to them in TikTok feeds and Instagram reels, in different platforms they use, but there are real questions that our industry and the broader technology industry needs to have about equity and the flow of information when it comes to this conflict in particular.
Yeah, and just to add briefly that the the nature of the pipes matters when it comes to this stuff. So the difference between Ukraine, which has many sort of cable and other bases for their internet access, versus Gaza, which has more constrained internet access, it does not control. And then what we see increasingly is the role of space-based communications alternatives, which are controlled by the private sector. And so we do think quite a lot about the civilianization of conflict, where civilians are being drawn into the conduct of conflict because they are using private sector infrastructure or being encouraged to do things on their own. And the role of private sector actors who are small in number, who are not diverse, who are not located in these places, is an interesting element of what's unfolding as we see that these new technologies becoming more critical and who controls them.
I want to plug a piece by a journalist named Lila Hassan who wrote in Wired magazine about the effects. I talked about this in the context of the flow of information, access to the public. She had a great piece in Wired that looked at the effects on just people in Gaza to not have that. For humanitarian work in the region, I'd really encourage you to read it because it goes beyond this. From looking at this as largely about a journalistic lens or the public or the West, I really think there's some powerful reporting in there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I know we are just about at time, but I want to make sure that we are able to hear from the folks online. So I'm going to hand it very briefly over to Ahmed to highlight one of the one of the top level comments or questions that we have received, and then we'll give everyone just a very quick response to that to close us out. Thank you, Ahmed.
Thank you, Catherine. There's no one has left any comments or questions in the Q&A button, but thank you for everyone who has attended this, and for the questions that were raised by the attendees who are there in person. And I'd like to extend a lot of thanks to our panelists who have provided us with wonderful insights and just really valuable perspectives in terms of on this particular issue and connecting it to other conflict areas that are happening right now. So thank you all.
Thank you, Ahmed. And let me also reiterate that thank you to our panelists for all of the insights that you've shared. You have given us so much to walk away with and think about on the role and risks of technology in humanitarian and conflict-affected settings. And the issues that you've discussed today so aptly captured the themes that we've been grappling with throughout the series around accountability, around recognition, around reach of services in humanitarian settings, particularly in heavily conflict-affected settings. And as we take away some of these rich reflections, as we close out our final panel today, I want you to know that this is not the last that you will hear from us. We do intend to write up and share some of the lessons and themes that we have explored throughout this 4-panel series. So watch this space, and of course, a link to the recording will be made available and will be sent out to registrants, so you will have access to that as well. So let me just thank again our panelists for the work that they have done and the time that they have spent in sharing with us today. Thank you to our audience, both in person and online, for sharing your questions. Many thanks to the Lee Center and the Columbia Journalism School for hosting us today, and to Asmat for partnering with us for this event, and to Mindy Meyer, who worked with us tirelessly to bring us all together today. I would also like to thank my colleagues at the Amman Global Center, Hanya Salah, Director of the Center, and Dr. Ahmed Al-Musa, who you just heard from, Senior Program Manager, for working with us throughout the year to pull together this event and the 4 Insights and Deep Diving panels. And of course, many thanks to my colleagues at the Program on Forced Migration and Health, Monette Zard, Jill Brennick, and Jen Ostrowski, who have all been instrumental in bringing the series together and making it a reality. Thank you.
And Belkis, thank you for doing this from Ukraine. You're amazing. Thank you.
My pleasure. Wish I was there.